Hey people, John here from Fast Films, and today we're going through a 2007 crime drama movie called Savage Grace. The film begins with a woman holding a baby while a male voice narrates the story. The narrator describes his mother and father and talks about their personalities. Then the narrator is revealed to be the baby named Tony. The woman, Barbara Baekeland, makes a call to a friend to make reservations for a meeting at the club happening at 10:30 p.m. that night. Meanwhile, her husband, Brooks Baekeland, walks in and seems quite upset as she made arrangements without consulting him. She calls another friend to request their availability at the club. Brooks tells Barbara that he doesn't appreciate being treated like a monkey. He tells her that he won't put on a monkey suit just because he is going to a party. Barbara tells him to wear his military uniform because he looks good in that. Brooks asks Barbara if she plans on leaving their son Tony alone in the house. Barbara tells him that Nene will be around shortly to watch over the baby. Afterward, Barbara and Brooks arrive at the Blue Storks Club and are shown to their seats. They greet the other guests at the table. Barbara urges Brooks to tell their friends at the table the story of his journey to Vilcabamba, Peru. Brooks tells them that he was intrigued by the 400 years history of the ruins of Manco Inca. The guests begin to play games where they ask each other if they would do certain things for $1 million. Simone is asked if she would eat a pound of human flesh for $1 million. She replies and tells that she once ate horseflesh. Barbara asks Brooks if he would sleep with Simone for $1 million. Brooks says no. She again asks if Brooks could go home with the first person he sees outside a nightclub. This time Brooks replies yes and asks if they could stop the games and go back to drinking. As they exit the club, Barbara stops a random car and asks the man if he would buy him a drink. Brooks angrily protests her behavior, but Barbara tells him that if he could go home with the first woman he sees outside a nightclub, then she can also do the same. She enters the car and drives off with the stranger while Brooks returns home alone. The next morning, Barbara returns home and feeds the baby. A couple of years later, an older Tony serves Barbara breakfast in bed and inquires about their plans for the night. Barbara tells him that she plans to hang out with some of her friends. Tony tells her that such places won't be fun for a child and asks Barbara if they could spend the afternoon together. Barbara agrees and asks Tony to help her fetch some medicine for her hangover. In the next scene, Brooks is fencing with an opponent. He knocks his opponent to the ground, and the opponent surrenders. Meanwhile, Barbara and Tony are spending the day together. While taking a walk at the park, they talk about their old dog Giotto, who passed on some years ago. On the other side, Brooks and his fencing opponent discuss in the restroom while they freshen up. They talk about Brooks's father and grandfather. They also talk about Barbara. Brooks says that most men find Barbara attractive, but she doesn't want to accept that most women also find him attractive. Afterward, Barbara and Brooks have lunch with their friends Pilar, Carlos, and Sylvester. While they have lunch, Barbara tells Sylvester that her understanding of the French language is not very good, but Brooks and her son Tony speak French fluently. Pilar informs Barbara that Sylvester has to leave as soon as possible. But Barbara insists that Sylvester must meet Tony before he leaves. As she leaves for Tony, Sylvester makes a rude comment about Barbara in French. Barbara arrives back at the dining room and introduces Tony to the guests. Tony greets them in both Spanish and French languages. Barbara tries to impress the guests by making Tony read from a French book, but unfortunately Tony could not read the book. Tony apologizes to the guests, but Sylvester tells him that if there is no problem, then there is no solution. This statement angers Barbara and she chastises Sylvester. As the guests leave, Brooks goes with them. Later on, Brooks checks into a hotel room alone, and a couple of minutes later, he is joined in the room by Barbara, who had bribed the concierge to gain access to the room. The next day, when they return home, they find a boy in Tony's room. They ask Tony who the boy was. Tony explains to them that he was feeling lonely when they left and he invited his classmate Francois over for a sleepover. Brooks instructs him to tell his friend to leave. Up next, we see Tony is now a fully grown man. He hangs out with his friends at the beach and plays the guitar for them. In the next scene, Tony has lunch with Brooks. Brooks tells him about women and their many troubles. He tells him that women are fond of telling men what to do and that his mother is just the same. Tony tries to defend his mother, but Brooks tells him not to. Afterward, Tony meets a Spanish girl named Blanca at the beach with his friend. They share a cigarette together and dance. In the next scene, Tony tells Brooks and Barbara about Blanca and says that he doesn't care if she is from a wealthy family. In the next scene, Barbara, Brooks, Tony, and Blanca take a trip out of the city. At the bar, Brooks tells Blanca about the Baekeland family history. Barbara and Tony order more drinks because they are getting bored by the discussion. At night, they make their way to their bedrooms. Next, Barbara is seen going to an airport where she finds Brooks and Blanca together. She accuses Brooks of flirting with his own son's girlfriend and she tries to draw his attention to the point that Blanca is just with him because of the money. She leaves them at the airport and goes back home. Afterward, Barbara returns to the house to find Tony and his friend Jake. She tells them that she saw Brooks at the airport and gave him a piece of her mind. Barbara tells Tony that she will be meeting with Sam for dinner. Barbara meets with Sam and Sam gives her advice on how to get her life back on track without Brooks. In the next scene, Barbara and Tony drive back to the villa. In the car, Tony tells Barbara that he hasn't been able to reach Brooks on the phone. Barbara tells him that there is no need to understand Brooks or justify his ways. At the villa, Tony plays the guitar on the steps of the villa. Sam approaches him and they have a conversation about Tony's life. He tells to Tony that while he takes care of his mother Barbara and his boyfriend Jake, he also needs someone to take care of him. The next day, Sam writes a letter to his father Brooks, begging him to come back to Barbara. He tells him that Barbara has been miserable and unhappy since he left. He tells Brooks that Barbara needs him but she is just too proud to admit it. He takes the letter to Brooks's apartment and looks for a place to drop it off. Brooks sees him from the window but hides himself. Blanca also sees Tony trying to bury the letter in the garden and runs downstairs to talk to him. Tony rides away on his bicycle when he sees her coming. She takes the letter from the garden and goes back into the house with it. Later on, Barbara tries to do some painting but becomes frustrated and gives up. Sam approaches her to comfort her and then they come closer and have relations. The next day, Sam leaves the villa and Barbara mentions to him how the house would be so boring without him. In the next scene, Tony writes to Brooks again telling him of Barbara's illness and how she has been taking a lot of sleeping pills. He tells her that he miraculously found her before it was too late and took her to the hospital. Afterward, Barbara gets recovered and has dinner with Tony and they discuss Paris. Up next, Tony is seen writing in his diary. He narrates that he and Barbara relocated to France to start a new life. In their apartment in France, Tony begins to write in a journal. He picks up a book written by his grandfather and begins to flip through it. Meanwhile, his mother calls him into the bathroom where he helps her apply some ointment on her wrist. Then Barbara and Tony go to attend a funeral service. Brooks and Blanca are also at the funeral but they do not talk to each other. Later on, in London, Barbara meets with a friend to plan an event after her art show. Barbara returns home to find Tony waiting for her. Tony asks her where she hid Jodo's collar but she tells him it was not her business to track where he keeps his personal objects. She compliments Tony's choice of clothing and then they have incestuous relations. After they are done, Tony throws a tantrum about Jodo's missing collar. He forces Barbara to join him in looking for the collar. After a while he finds it. Barbara finds him holding the collar and sulking. She tells him that he is no longer a baby. Tony accuses his mother of hiding the collar. She tells him that perhaps he kept it in the cupboard for safekeeping and forgot about it. Tony picks up a knife and begins to ramble about a paper he found written by Barbara. He tells her that he tore up the paper and flushed it down the toilet. Barbara tells him that he is saying nonsense and that she cannot understand him. While they argue, Tony attacks her with the knife. Realizing what he has done, he goes to call the ambulance. After calling the ambulance, he places an order for Chinese food. The order arrives and Tony begins to eat it while sitting beside Barbara's body. A police officer comes in and asks Tony if he is Mr. Bakeland and if the woman on the floor is his mother. Tony answers yes and he is escorted into the police car by the officer while Barbara's body is covered up and carried into the ambulance. In the next scene, Tony writes a letter to his father. In the letter, he describes his pathetic existence. His father writes back to him telling him that a funeral mass would be held for Barbara by her friends and people who knew her well. Tony is found guilty of murder under diminished ability and is sent to a mental institution. He is released a year later and moves in with his grandmother Nini. Within a week of his return, he attacks Nini during an argument. Luckily she survives, and Tony is sentenced to jail in Rikers Island. Tony died in Rikers Island in 1981. The film ends here. Thanks for watching.